This video is going to explore the social history of the modern West after World War II. Again, it's more of an overview. There are more specific videos included in the module. Overall, when we look at the modern West, the second half of the 20th century, we see growing economic prosperity, growing interdependence on different parts of the world, but we also see greater individual liberty. And we see with this liberty greater uncertainty and a search for meaning to life after the disasters of the early 20th century. And so we begin with agriculture. Agriculture, which becomes immensely more efficient in the years after World War II as a result of mechanization. We go from a situation where one farmer feeds about 7 people to a situation where one farmer feeds about 40 people. One farmer feeds about 7 people in 1950. One farmer feeds about 40 people in 1962. We can imagine that it's far more than that today, but that just gives you a sense of how agriculture is becoming more effective and is really booming in the years after World War II. We also see the emergence of genetically engineered crops, which both make agriculture still more efficient and provide new challenges to natural plant and animal life. We turn to industry, we find another boom. Goods that were seen as luxuries prior to World War II, refrigerators, indoor plumbing, these become commonplace in most people's lives in the modern West. Things that today we very much take for granted had been considered luxuries only in the 1930s and 40s. We also see a growth in house ownership in the United States of America and the growth of suburbanization, the growth of single family homes. So the individual family, again, socially speaking, it's a society that's becoming more individualized and more distinct. And we see that in this growth of individual homes outside the centers of the cities. Global finances, on the other hand, so again, there's this parallel between economic dependence and social independence. Global finances are becoming more interconnected and more interdependent. Different parts of the world are more dependent on one another. Different parts of the world are providing supplies. Other parts of the world are buying those supplies and those products. And this is the transition we see take place in the West, that the West becomes the consumer market for much of the rest of the world, that there are new, cheap artifacts and products that are now available to be purchased in the West, oftentimes that have been produced in somewhat dubious labor conditions in other parts of the world. And at the same time, we also see the growth in importance of other economies around the world, including Latin American and East Asian economies. They also cover media technology, beginning with cassette players in the 70s, television in the 80s, and then the internet in the 90s. All these new inventions help to bring the world more closely into similarity. Different regions of the world now listen to the same music, watch the same TV productions, and read the same information on the web. So at the same time as socially, they're becoming more independent. Financially speaking, economically speaking, even culturally speaking, people are becoming more similar. Their experiences of life in different countries are becoming more similar. The great example, of course, of the society becoming socially more independent is the sexual revolution, which is typically dated from the 60s. And it's where these ideas of independence and liberation that we've talked about all the way back to the Enlightenment make their way into the realm of sexuality. We see this with the development of oral contraceptives and the independence that provides, especially for women who are then encouraged to have careers, the aspect of independence that this in itself lends to marriages, which become much more fragile. We see the rate of divorce increase, and even lack of marriage. People choosing not to get married, people choosing to have children out of wedlock, people choosing to have abortions, and abortion becoming legalized. These are all aspects of behavior connected to sexuality that stem from this emphasis on individual liberty and individual freedom. We also see this same approach to the individualization of sexuality and the liberation of sexuality in the decriminalization of homosexuality, which begins in the 1960s with the legalization of prostitution, the widespread acceptance of pornography. These are all aspects of a liberation of sexuality and sexual behaviors, which up until this point, at least publicly speaking, had been frowned upon and had been disapproved of. Lastly, we come to the philosophy of the modern West. And the philosophy of the modern West is shaped around two philosophical schools, existentialism and structuralism. Existentialism, shaped by the philosopher Sartre, is an extension of the sort of cultural despair that I talked about that we see in Europe after World War I, now exaggerated after World War II and the Holocaust. In the philosophy of the existentialists, we see a growing bewilderment that society, the Enlightenment, the progress that was promised, has instead delivered genocide and war. And the solution the existentialist philosophers move towards is to say that there is no meaning to the universe and to the world and even to life itself. But that such meaning as can be found can only be created through the individuals themselves. That there is no meaning to life that we find consistent across different human beings, that instead meaning is something that's constructed by the individual themselves, that they determine what is meaningful to them in their life. And then structuralism kind of follows on from this. Structuralism takes this idea of meaning and applies this to language and to reality, but especially to language. And structuralism is the idea that language itself is a construct, that language doesn't necessarily reflect the reality and independent reality that all human beings are experiencing, but it reflects the way an individual is perceiving and constructing reality. And this in turn provides the foundation for later 20th century philosophers like Foucault to argue that therefore all human relationships which are a product of language are some kind of dynamic of oppression and power. And so this is where we leave the modern West. It's a society that's economically very prosperous because it has made itself more dependent on other parts of the world. At the same time, it is a society that is socially lacking in confidence and very uncertain as to the meaning of this economic wealth.